You know, and this is a kind of an interesting question, actually. I'm kind of meditating on this a little bit, because I do think the book transcends, even though it's kind of a bit of an instruction manual for Christians in a way, it seems to transcend that, right? So it made me think about, you know, basically the spiritual qualities that make resistance to whatever form of totalitarianism possible, right? I mean, it's because, you know, you described a situation where someone imagined themselves to be able to be like Christ and endure that suffering. But, you know, that's not what Peter Boghossian is thinking. That's not what what are these characteristics? Have you given some thought to this?
I think it is a passionate commitment to truth. Live not by lies, live in truth. Václav Havel, the playwright who led the Czech dissident movement and became the first president of a free Czechoslovakia, in 1977 he told this parable of the greengrocer. This was his example of why you should live in truth. He said, imagine that you have a greengrocer in a communist city who has a sign hanging in the window of his shop saying, "Workers of the world, unite," the Marxist slogan. All the shopkeepers have this sign in the window. Nobody believes it, but they put it there so they won't have trouble. Well, what happens, said Havel, if one day the greengrocer pulls the sign down? He said, I'm not going to put this up there. It's a lie. Well, the secret police come, they arrest him, they take away his business. He has to go mop floors or something for a living. His family loses privileges, they can't travel, the kids can't get into college, etc., etc. He suffers a serious loss. But what has he gained? Aside from his integrity, maintaining his integrity, he has also shown the rest of the watching world that it is possible to live in truth, to live not by lies, if one is willing to suffer and pay a price for it. And I think this is the sort of thing that people like Barry Weiss, like Brett Weinstein, Heather Hine, Peter Boghossian, and others, this is what they live by. There's a lot of nobility in that. There's real virtue in that. Virtue that, sadly, many of my fellow Christians do not have. So I think that is a key thing. And also, as we talked about the importance of suffering, I talk about in Live Not by Lies about this great movie by Terrence Malick, the American film director Terrence Malick, called A Hidden Life. It's based on the true story of Franz Jägerstätter. Franz Jägerstätter was an Austrian Catholic farmer who was killed by the Nazis because he refused to swear allegiance to Hitler. In the movie, it starts out in their little village high up in the Alpine mountains of Austria, where you think they would have been safe from Nazism, but of course they weren't. When the Nazis came to town, most everybody in the village, and they were all Catholics, most of them became Nazis, except Franz and his family. And at one point, Franz walks to the village church and he sees an artist painting pictures on the wall from the Bible, of the life of Jesus and so forth. And the artist tells him, he said, you know, people come into this church and they see these paintings and they admire Jesus. But Jesus didn't call admirers. He called disciples. How do you tell the difference between an admirer and a disciple? By the willingness to suffer. When persecution comes, that's how you determine who really believes this stuff, that's how you figure out for whom it is life itself, not just an add-on to life, but life itself. You can look at this in a secular way too. You and I are sitting here talking in front of the founding fathers. You know, today in America, are we admirers of liberty and democracy, or are we disciples of liberty and democracy? You'll be able to tell the difference when it comes to persecution. Those, whether they're religious or not, or whatever their religion, those who are willing to stand up for the truth and to stand up for liberty will prove themselves to be true disciples of liberty. And the rest who conform and keep their heads down, they never were.
You know, and it just strikes me, there's sort of, I mean, this is almost bizarre to say, but it's actually, we're talking about a commitment to objective reality. That's a commonality here, right?
That's right.
An objective truth, a shared reality. That would be at least a piece of the pie.
That's true. And you know, when I was in Poland interviewing people for the book, this one Polish professor said he was so concerned about the young generation, the post-communist generation in his country. He said, we who grew up under communism came to understand how the state manipulated language to create a sense of unreality around us. And we figured out how to see right through that. But these kids who've been raised in freedom, for all the blessings of freedom, they don't have this inoculation against lies. And so when you have this new language coming in talking about, well, who knows what a woman is or a man is? We're gender fluid, we're this, we're that. All of these things, they are not vaccinated against this ideological virus. And so he said that we're seeing a lot of our young people who don't understand how this works, accepting this woke propaganda coming in from the West and assuming that this tells us what the world really is, when in fact it is a falsification of reality.
On the one hand, there's this commitment to some sort of, objective reality, I think, that's shared, but there's something where there's a kind of a willingness, and I don't know where this comes from. I don't know if it's exactly courage. I've been thinking about this a lot, but a willingness to not just go along with whatever sort of the tide of society is, which, as you mentioned, many people are just, naturally going to, I don't know if it's naturally, but are just going to do. Mm-hmm. So it's a rare trait. And what is that? And I do think it's a commonality that we share.
Yeah, it's a willingness to go against the flow. G.K. Chesterton said that a dead thing can go along with the stream, but only a living thing can go against the stream. And we're seeing this happen today, right now in Europe, for example. Some of the bravest people I know are vaccine resistors. Now, to be clear, I've been vaccinated myself. I'm not against vaccines at all, but I'm also against vaccine mandates because I think this is laying the groundwork for totalitarian rule. We're seeing this happen in Europe everywhere today. If you resist the mandatory vaccines in Austria and more countries, you pay a severe price. And there are people, not only Christians, but people willing to pay that price for this principle. I think these people are heroic, frankly. And this is the sort of thing I want to cultivate in my children, whatever the issue is. Mm-hmm. Do not go along with the crowd. I'm from the deep South, South Louisiana, a small town. And when I was born in 1967, so I have no memory of the segregation times, of the Jim Crow times. But when I moved back to my hometown 10 years ago, I discovered that in 1964, on the courthouse lawn, there was a white riot. A black man, a pastor, tried to register to vote and successfully did, the first black man to register to vote in like 63 years there. And whites rioted against it. It was appalling to read this, and also to know that probably in that crowd were some men that I grew up respecting, having no idea that they had done this. And for me, it was just so shocking to realize that in my beautiful little peaceful town that this violence, this racist violence had happened just before I was born. But I also had to face the fact that what if I had been a young man at this time? Chances are I would have been in that crowd rioting. I hate to think about it, but when I was thinking about what made people racist back then, if you were of my parents' generation, my dad was born in the 30s, my mom in the early 40s, you had no way of knowing in any counter narrative to white supremacy. This was life. They had radio, but radio never talked about it. The newspapers never talked about it. These people, not to excuse them at all, but these people, my parents' generation, really were ignorant of the evil that they did. I think at some level they had to have known it was evil, but certainly the churches didn't preach against it. I had to face this in myself, though, where I like to think that I would have stood up there against the mob and defended these black folks. But chances are I would have been just as cowardly as the rest of them. And I might not have joined the mob, but I would have kept my head down to avoid trouble. I think all of us have that within ourselves, that capacity to be cowardly. And it's important to realize it now. Just last week, as we're talking, I heard from an American missionary, I can't mention his name now, but he had been put in prison in an Islamic country for his missionary work. And he told me that he had always imagined that he would be very brave in prison. He said, in fact, I broke, but that taught me something about what we need, the sort of skills we need and the virtues that we need to inculcate in ourselves in order to be strong. I'm going to be meeting with this man in a couple of weeks, and he wants to share this with me, so hopefully I can write about it. But it's important that we're humble about this sort of thing and recognize our own capacity for conformity. If you had been alive and a white person in my hometown in 1964, if you had stood up against that racist mob to defend these black citizens, you would have put your own life at risk. How many of us would have really done that? I can't say that I would have done that. I hope I would have, but I can't say for sure that I would have. I think right now is a time for all of us, everyone listening to this broadcast, to think hard about this. How much would you suffer for the sake of truth and justice and for your faith if you're a person of faith? If you're not thinking through this right now and imagining these scenarios where you could lose your job, you could lose your liberty, and you might even have to lose your life for the sake of the truth, if you're not thinking about this now, then you're going to be caught flat-footed and you may ultimately capitulate.
It makes me think of that, sort of, I guess now famous image that we've seen in social media a lot of the kind of one man that is not doing the Sieg Heil. Right? And I forget, I remember reading the story and why most people believe that they would be people like him that would not do it. But the reality is, it was a very tough thing to do.
Yeah, and you can't wait until you're put to the test.
Yeah.
By then it's too late. I mean, think about that iconic image from my own college years of that one lone Chinese protester in Tiananmen Square who stood in front of the tank. You want to be that guy, but that guy didn't become that guy in that moment. We don't know who that was, but everything that led him to that point had built in him the kind of conscience that gave him that courage. Similarly with Franz Jägerstätter, the man I mentioned earlier, who was murdered because he wouldn't swear allegiance to Hitler. And all these dissidents, the small decisions they took in everyday life leading up to the moment of testing gave them the courage and the wherewithal and the reason to take the stands that they did. And I remember a few years ago, after the Obergefell ruling came down from the U.S. Supreme Court legalizing gay marriage, in the state of California, the LGBT caucus in the state legislature put forth a bill that would have taken away Cal grants, that's direct grants, student aid grants to poor students, would have taken them away from students who wanted to use them to go to Christian colleges. The LGBT folks called them bigot colleges because these were conservative Christian colleges that didn't approve of homosexuality. The way the law stood is that poor students could use these grants at any accredited college, but the LGBT caucus wanted to change it where they wouldn't be able to use these for these religious colleges. It would have meant the closure of about 100 small religious colleges in California, or those colleges would have had to violate their conscience. Well, a friend of mine who's a senior administrator at a Christian college there led a group down to the mega churches of Orange County, which is a very conservative evangelical place in Southern California. They wanted to rally support in these churches. They went to talk to pastors. He told me that we could not find a single pastor who was willing to stand with us for the liberty of these colleges. I said, why not? He said, every single one of them was afraid of being called a bigot, even though they agreed with us. He told me that if it hadn't been for the Hispanic Catholic Archbishop of Los Angeles and the Black Pentecostal pastors of South Central Los Angeles, we would have lost that fight. The fact was that all these comfortable suburban evangelical conservatives were not willing to stand up when it counted. And we cannot allow ourselves to be this way. We can't be those people. We have to develop the courage right now to know that when the time comes for our testing, that we will take that tough stand.
And you're just making me think that, courage kind of comes sometimes in very unexpected places. Like what motivated me back in the day to get sort of into China human rights issues way back when. This was 20 odd years ago. I became very interested, and I met a woman at the university who had made it out of China, and her just kind of very, very simple woman, I think between 65, 70 years old. And her crime was, she was a Falun Gong practitioner, and her crime was that she refused to sign a piece of paper that said, "I renounce this." And they tortured her, and she had the scars to prove it. And it was, and it was the sort of person you would never expect, would have to face this sort of thing. I'm sure she never expected that she would have to face this sort of thing, but somehow she just simply wouldn't do that. And but today, I can't help but think, like, some folks might even be perplexed by this. Hey, why not just sign the piece of paper?
Yeah. Because, well, if you believe in transcendent values, whether you believe in a personal God or you believe there are things that are transcendently ideal, you can't just sign the paper without signing over your soul in some real sense, even if you don't believe in an afterlife. And I think what you're touching on is the importance of religious belief, broadly considered, to giving people the wherewithal to resist. Now, as we've been talking, you don't have to be religious in order to resist. There are courageous atheists who have resisted as well. But boy, does it help when you believe that your suffering has ultimate moral and even metaphysical meaning. It can be so much easier to stand up. I tell the story in the book about this man, Alexander Ogorodnikov. He was a late Soviet dissident. Ogorodnikov came from a very prominent communist family, but in the early 70s, he lost his faith in communism and became a Christian. In his apartment in Moscow, he started a prayer group, and young people were finding their way to his prayer group from throughout the city. Young people who had lost all faith in communism, but they were looking for something, and they found it coming to his apartment to pray and to study scripture. They knew the KGB was watching them, and they knew that they were all going to end up in prison someday, and eventually they did. Ogorodnikov told me that they put him on death row. The Soviets did. Even though he didn't have a death sentence, they wanted to make an example of him because he came from such a privileged communist family. They put him with the worst of the worst prisoners in Russia. He went in there and he began to share the gospel with them. Well, eventually the wardens got sick of this because he was making converts, so they put him in isolation and they began to torture him in solitary confinement. As he was telling me this story in a hotel in Moscow, I noticed that his face was partially paralyzed, and that was from the beatings he took. Anyway, he told me that he began to lose his faith. He began to doubt that he had an ultimate mission there in the prison, even as a Christian. One night, he said, he was awakened by a vision. An angel woke him up. He said he saw this with his eyes and showed him a prisoner being led to his execution with his hands cuffed behind his back with a guard on either side. And Ogorodnikov knew this man was being taken to be executed. This was a guy he had shared the gospel with, and the guy converted. Well, night after night, this kept happening with a different person each night. Ogorodnikov finally realized that he was being shown men who were having their death sentence carried out, but they had repented of their sins and were going to be in paradise with God because Ogorodnikov had been there to share God's love with them. And this old man, he's old now, he was telling me this with tears going down his cheeks. He's saying, I regained my faith. And he understood that God had a purpose for him to suffer as he had. I think that God has a purpose. I'm a Christian myself, and an Orthodox Christian as Ogorodnikov. I believe God has a purpose for each and every one of us, even those who don't believe in him, and that purpose involves, at some level, it's going to involve being willing to accept suffering and not let the suffering destroy us, but instead turn it around and allow it to build ourselves up and purify our own consciences, and to help other people who are struggling to bear the burden of suffering without despairing, and in fact using it to become more compassionate.
Yeah, it's a beautiful vision. And I mean, as we finish up, I guess I want to think about, we've talked about different elements of this throughout our chat today. But I mean, I'm sure a lot of people are coming to you right now and having read Live Not by Lies and say, Rod, you know, what can I do? Okay, we can start Kolakovich groups. You know, we can, how do we train for suffering? That seems like a strange idea. What is your broad, I guess, you know, prescription would be the right word at this point. I'm sure you have one.
Sure. Well, the most important thing is to found the Kolakovich groups. But whether you're religious or not, you need to form these groups to talk about what's coming and what you can do where you are. It's not going to look the same in New York City as it will in Duluth or in some small town somewhere, but this is crucial. It's also crucial to read as widely as you can about what's happening in the world, but also to read the literature of the dissidents, the anti-communist dissidents. Read these stories. They're incredible. I tell the story in Live Not by Lies about Father George Calciu, who was a Romanian Orthodox priest who was put in what is widely considered to be the worst prison of the entire communist bloc in Pitești in Romania. The things that the communists made those prisoners do are unspeakable. But there's a book by Father George of his talks and his interviews that you can get. And I would read some of these to my children, not the worst of it, but just Father George talking about the value of suffering and what it meant to be a faithful Christian is to accept the possibility of suffering. Not look for it, but accept it. People can do this sort of thing right now. Read these stories of heroic men and women who have resisted totalitarianism, especially communist totalitarianism, and come through with their faith or their integrity intact. Because if we read these stories, it's not just abstract anymore. There's a real people. I would also advise people to find in your own neighborhood, in your church, in your social circles, in your job, if you know people who came to this country escaping communism, whether it was Soviet communism or Chinese communism or Cuba, wherever, talk to them about what they're seeing. Chances are they're dying to talk to you about it, to warn you, but they're afraid. Make it possible for them to tell their stories and ask them for their advice. Humble yourself as an American to realize that we don't know everything. These people have been given the gift of suffering where they came from, and they can use this gift to build us up right now so that we can either stop it coming to America, or if it comes, we can hold our head high and refuse to conform. And finally, I would say to parents, do as Camilla and Václav Benda did. Prepare your children. Don't shield them from these horrible things, because they're going to have to go out into the world, and you want them to be young men and women of vision, of faith, and of courage. Share with them what's happening insofar as it's age appropriate, and also read to them the classics. Read to them The Lord of the Rings and help them to understand that the virtues that are made to inhabit these characters and these storylines are things that are real and that we can live by too. Camilla Benda told me that the dragons of Tolkien were more real than some of the things they were actually living with. So, I mean, these things are so important. There's no reason to despair. We have to get rid of any sort of happy-clappy optimism that we have about what's coming. We have to be realistic, because only if we're realistic and looking at the struggles coming can we build ourselves up to resist it. People say to me, if you see all this coming, how do you maintain hope? I say there's a difference between optimism and hope. Someone who's optimistic expects that everything's going to be okay no matter what. Well, that's just not true. We hope it will, but it's not true. But someone who is hopeful knows that even if it comes to the worst of it, if we can resist without losing our faith, without losing our integrity, without losing our souls, then God can, in some sense, use our sacrifice and our suffering to make the world a better place and inspire people to be brave and compassionate.
I mean, powerful vision here, and it reminds me of a line where you reference again Solzhenitsyn, where he's grateful for his terrible, terrible prison experience.
Bless you, prison.
I think if we can learn to value, not wish for, but value the suffering that we inadvertently will have in different forms, and that can make us stronger.
It can. Solzhenitsyn said in the Gulag Archipelago that after his horrible experience in prison, he was able to write honestly, "Bless you, prison." Well, how could he say that? He said that because the prison experience awakened his soul. It led him to a religious conversion, but it also led him to think about his own life and the Soviet system and what it actually did to people, how it ground down humanity. And it made a dissident of him, and it made him indomitable. So the prison experience, as horrible as it was, refined him. And it also destroyed many other people. We shouldn't look at prison or persecution as something that inevitably makes us better. We have to meet this persecution, we have to meet this suffering with a disposition of soul that allows it to work this alchemy within ourselves. Like Dr. Krčméry, Silvo Krčméry, he came out of there a saint. It made him a saint. He's not been canonized. I believe it made him a saint. But again, this is something we can control. We can't control whether or not suffering comes to us, but we can control how we react to it. And this is the real secret that the dissidents have to share with us, that these things are within our control, but we have to learn from the past so we can meet the future with courage.
Well, Rod Dreher, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
We live in an age of weaponized information and censorship. To be the first to know about new American Thought Leaders episodes and related content, you can sign up for our newsletter at theepochtimes.com/newsletter. You can just hit the check mark on American Thought Leaders.